"You want me to marry her," Luke Maddox said. "Abigail Carter." "By Friday," the clerk said, "or you lose the ranch." Luke looked at the document. Marriage contract. His name. Her name. The woman this entire county had spent 15 years walking past like she was furniture. The woman they whispered about in dry goods stores and church pews, the old maid. The peculiar one, too smart and too quiet, and too everything that made small-minded people uncomfortable. He picked up the pen. He signed it. And in that single moment, ink still wet, hand still moving, Luke Maddox made the only decision in his life he would never once regret. If you're just finding this channel, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Luke Maddox had never been a man who asked for help. In 22 years of working the Maddox homestead, the same land his father had broken his back, on the same land his grandfather had staked a claim on, with nothing but a mule and a prayer, he had survived 3 droughts, 1 catastrophic hailstorm, and a cattle fever that wiped out half his herd in a single brutal August. He had survived all of it alone. He had never once walked into the county office hat in hand, until the morning Earl Gibbs told him about the Homestead Relief Act. "It's not charity," Earl said. He was sitting across from Luke in the feed store, his boots propped up on a grain sack the way he always sat when he was about to tell someone something they didn't want to hear. "It's a federal contract. You qualify for the land stabilization credit. Covers your back taxes, restructures your operating debt, and gives you a 3-year interest suspension." Luke said nothing. "There's one condition," Earl said. "Say it." "Applicant must be married. Household status, they call it. Congress put it in to encourage settled family homesteads. Single men don't qualify." Luke looked at him for a long time. "I've been running that ranch alone for 6 years. I know. My father ran it alone for 11. I know that too, Luke. And they want me to get married to qualify for a piece of paper." Earl picked up his coffee. "By Friday." The county relief office smelled like ink and old wood, and the particular brand of bureaucratic patience that had never once made room for a man in a hurry. Luke stood at the front desk with his documents in one hand and his hat in the other, and he waited while the woman behind the counter finished writing something in a ledger without acknowledging him. He cleared his throat. "I heard you," she said without looking up. He set his hat on the counter. "I'm here about the Homestead Relief Act. I was told to speak with the coordinator." "You are speaking with the coordinator." She closed the ledger and looked at him directly for the first time. "You're Luke Maddox." It wasn't a question. Her eyes were steady and precise, the kind of eyes that had catalogued everything about him before he'd opened his mouth. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, plain dressed with dark hair pinned back without ceremony. Her face was calm in a way that felt deliberate, not coldness, but the particular composure of someone who had learned not to let other people's discomfort become her problem. "Abigail Carter," she said. She extended her hand across the counter and he shook it. Her grip was firm. "They told me you could walk me through the application." "I can." She came around the counter and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down." He sat. She spread a set of documents in front of him with practiced efficiency, walking through each section with the clarity of someone who had done it many times and had no patience for confusion. She explained the credit structure, the timeline, the federal verification requirements. She answered questions before he thought to ask them. She never fumbled for a word. When she got to the final page, she paused. "There's a household requirement," she said. "I know. You're not currently married." "No." She was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just careful. "There are men who have entered into legal marriages of convenience to satisfy the requirement. It's not common, but it's within the statute. The marriage must be documented, witnessed, and registered with the county. It must be entered into willingly by both parties. It cannot be dissolved within 12 months of the contract activation without triggering a full repayment clause." Luke looked at her steadily. "You're the coordinator?" "Yes." "You process the applications?" "Yes." "And you're not married?" Something moved through her eyes that he couldn't quite read. "No," she said. "I'm not." The silence between them was very specific. Neither of them moved. The clock on the wall measured out 12 full seconds before Luke Maddox spoke again. "Miss Carter," he said, and his voice was careful, not unkind. "I'm going to say something that might be unusual." "Mr. Maddox," she said, and her voice matched his exactly in its careful quality. "I think I already know what it is." He expected her to say no. Any reasonable woman would have said no. He was a man she had met 40 minutes ago, asking her to marry him, not out of feeling or devotion, but out of financial desperation. And he knew it, and she knew it, and there was nothing in the offer that dressed itself up as anything other than what it was. He had been direct about that. He was not a man who softened things with language they didn't deserve. She had listened to all of it without flinching. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What would my role be on the ranch?" He blinked. "Your role." "I have a job here. I have responsibilities to this office and to the families in this county who depend on the relief program. I'm not leaving my position." "I wouldn't ask you to." "I would need my own space in the house, my own arrangements." "That's reasonable." "I would not be treated as a servant or as a burden. I would be treated as a person living in that house with rights and responsibilities equal to the practical situation." "Miss Carter." "And I want it in writing, not the legal marriage document. A separate agreement between us before the ceremony. What I'm expected to do, what you're expected to do. Clear terms." He looked at her for a long time. He had walked into this office expecting to beg. He had not expected to be interviewed. "You've thought about this before," he said. Something changed in her expression. It was subtle the way a light shifts when a cloud moves across the sun. "No," she said quietly. "But I know how to think quickly when I need to." He nodded once. "I'll have the agreement drawn up by tomorrow morning." She stood and extended her hand again. "Then we have a basis for a conversation, Mr. Maddox." He stood and shook it. "Luke." She looked at him steadily. "Abigail." The news traveled through Harlan County in the particular way that small-town news always traveled faster than it had any logical reason to, and with details attached that neither party had confirmed. By the following morning, everyone from the hardware store to the Methodist church had heard that Luke Maddox was marrying Abigail Carter. The reactions split cleanly down a line. The men who knew Luke were somewhere between confused and pitying. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, weathered in the way that outdoor work weathers a man into something lean and capable. He had never been short of female attention. That he had settled on Abigail Carter. Abigail Carter of all people struck them as either desperate or baffling, and most of them decided it was both. The women of Harlan County were more complicated. Some of them felt something close to relief on Abigail's behalf, a cautious pleasure that the woman who had been quietly passed over for 15 years was finally going to have a household of her own. Others felt something closer to offense on Luke's behalf, as though Abigail had somehow deceived a good man into a disadvantageous arrangement. And a small number felt the particular unease of people who had been unkind to someone and were now watching that someone's circumstances change in ways that might require them to reconsider. Martha Gibbons, who ran the dry goods store and had never in 30 years kept an opinion to herself, said it plainly to the 4 women standing in her shop on Tuesday morning. "He's doing it for the contract. Everyone knows that. Poor man had no choice." "She's not so bad," said Helen Trask, who was younger and had always felt a vague guilty sympathy for Abigail. "She's peculiar," Martha said. "Always has been. Too quiet. Too smart about things women don't need to be smart about. A man wants a wife, not a bookkeeper." "Maybe Luke Maddox wants a bookkeeper," Helen said. Martha gave her a look that closed the conversation. The ceremony was held at the courthouse on a Thursday, 3 days after Luke and Abigail had shaken hands across her desk. The judge's name was Harlan Pruitt, a dry man with reading glasses, and the expression of someone who had officiated too many weddings to find them remarkable. Luke had told exactly 2 people about the ceremony: his ranch foreman Del Sutter and his nearest neighbor Frank Aldridge, who had agreed to serve as a witness. Abigail had told no one, which meant she arrived at the courthouse alone, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had apparently picked herself, wearing a blue dress that was clean and pressed and nothing more. They had not planned for an audience. 63 people were there anyway. Luke did not know how they had found out. He suspected Martha Gibbons, though he would never be able to prove it. They lined the hallway outside the judge's chamber, crowded 3 deep on the courthouse steps, and watched through the glass panels of the main door with the unashamed attention of people who had decided that their curiosity outweighed their manners. He felt the back of his neck go hot when he saw them. He turned to Abigail, ready to apologize, and stopped. She was walking toward the courthouse door with her head straight and her shoulders back and her eyes forward. Not performing, not pretending. She simply was not going to give them a single bent inch of her posture, and the absolute refusal in her spine was the most quietly defiant thing he had ever seen a person do. He fell into step beside her without a word. She pushed the door open herself. The crowd parted. She walked through it like she had somewhere important to be, which she did. "Minute time." Judge Pruitt read the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had a county commission meeting at 2 o'clock. Luke stood on the left. Abigail stood on the right. Del Sutter and Frank Aldridge stood behind them with the slightly dazed expressions of men who had not expected an audience. When the judge got to the ring exchange, Luke realized he didn't have one. He had forgotten about the ring entirely. He stood there for a moment saying nothing, and he felt the silence stretch and felt 63 pairs of eyes on the back of his neck, and for the first time in his adult life, Luke Maddox did not know what to do with his hands. Abigail reached into the small drawstring bag she was carrying and produced a plain silver band. She held it out to him. "I bought 2, she said quietly, in a voice meant only for him. "The other one's in your left jacket pocket. I put it there this morning when you hung your coat in the hallway." He reached into his pocket. The ring was there. He looked at her. She looked back at him without any particular expression, just that steadiness waiting for him to catch up. He almost laughed. He didn't. This was not a moment for laughing, but the impulse was there, and it surprised him more than anything else that morning had. Judge Pruitt said, "Proceed when ready." Luke slid the ring onto her finger. She slid the ring onto his. The judge said the words. Luke said, "I do." And Abigail said, "I do." And then it was done, and they were married, and the courthouse crowd outside murmured like a single restless animal. "You may kiss the bride," Judge Pruitt said, the way he always did, because those were the words, and he was a man who said the words. Luke turned to Abigail. She looked back at him. There was a half-second in which neither of them moved, and in that half-second, the 63 people watching pressed slightly closer to the glass. He leaned in and kissed her cheek. Brief, respectful, a hair's breadth above formal. She did not pull back. She did not stiffen. She stood still and received it with the same composure she had brought to everything else. And when he pulled back, she turned to face the door. Then she did something that Luke Maddox had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. She smiled. Not at the crowd. Not at anyone watching. She turned slightly away from the door toward nothing in particular. And she smiled to herself. A quiet, private thing, small and genuine, the kind of smile that belonged entirely to the person feeling it, and not at all to anyone observing it. He saw it by accident. She didn't know he was still looking at her. He didn't know why it stopped him the way it did. He couldn't have said, standing there in that courthouse in his good jacket with a ring on his finger, and 63 strangers watching through the glass. Why that small private smile from a woman he barely knew settled somewhere in him like a thing that had been waiting to be placed. He only knew that it did. The ride to the ranch was quiet. They sat side by side in the wagon, the late morning light long and dusty across the flats, and neither of them forced conversation that didn't need to happen. After about a mile, Abigail said, "You're thinking about the crowd. Am I that obvious?" You've checked the road behind us twice. He had. I didn't plan for that many people. I know you didn't. It doesn't matter. She was looking straight ahead. People come to look at things they find strange. Once they've looked, they lose interest. Give it 2 weeks. You sound like you've had practice. She was quiet for a moment. I've had practice, she said. Something in the way she said it, without self-pity, without bitterness, just plain acknowledgement, sat heavier than complaint would have. He wanted to say something to it but didn't know what, and she didn't seem to need him to. The agreement, he said. I had it drawn up. I read it. You have questions. 1. She turned to look at him for the first time since they'd gotten in the wagon. It says I'm responsible for household management at my discretion. I want that to mean at my actual discretion, not subject to your approval on every small decision. That's what it means. Then we're aligned. She turned back to the road. He looked at her profile for a moment. The straight nose, the firm set of her jaw, the particular posture of someone who had never in their life waited for permission and wasn't about to start. Abigail, he said. Yes. I want to say something clearly before we get there. All right. This isn't what I wanted. Getting married this way under this kind of pressure. I want you to know I understand what I asked of you, and I'm not going to pretend it was anything other than what it was. She considered that for a moment. Then she said, I know what it was. I agreed to it with full information. You don't owe me apologies for a transaction we both chose. A pause. What I would appreciate is what the agreement says. Honesty, respect, clear communication. You'll have all of that. Then we're fine, Luke. It was the first time she had used his name without a trace of formality in it, and something in the way it sounded surprised him, casual, easy, as though it had always belonged in her mouth. The ranch road came up ahead of them, and he turned the horses, and they passed under the gate together, and the Maddox land spread out around them in all its scarred and stubborn expanse. Whatever this was, whatever it was going to become, it started here. He didn't yet know what to do with the fact that some part of him, the part he couldn't argue with, was not entirely sorry that it had. Del Sutter was waiting at the barn, with 4 of the ranch hands lined up behind him like a welcoming party that hadn't decided yet if it was welcoming anything. They were a particular breed of men, sun-worn, direct, deeply skeptical of change, and they watched the wagon roll in with the expressions of people who had already heard the news and were reserving judgment until they could form their own opinions with their own eyes. Del stepped forward as Luke set the brake. He was a compact, blunt man in his 50s, with 30 years of ranch work in every callus on his hands, and he was the closest thing Luke Maddox had ever had to a second opinion he actually trusted. Luke, he said. Del. Luke stepped down and turned to offer Abigail his hand. She took it, stepped down without any particular ceremony, and looked at the row of ranch hands with the same level assessing expression she had brought to everything else. Del looked at her. He looked at Luke. He looked at her again. Ma'am, he said. Mr. Sutter. She had clearly already learned his name. I understand you run the day-to-day operations here. I do. Good. I have no interest in interfering with that. What I would like when you have time this week is a walkthrough of the household records. Feed contracts, supply accounts, anything that flows through the domestic side. I want to understand what's here before I touch anything. Del looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a man recalibrating his assumptions. I can do that, he said. Thank you. She looked at the other men. I don't know your names yet. I will by the end of the week. They looked at each other. One of them, young freckled named Cody, though she didn't know that yet, said yes ma'am, without quite meaning to, and the man next to him elbowed him in the ribs. Luke watched all of it. He watched Del's expression shift almost imperceptibly from cautious to something more closely resembling interested. He watched Abigail move toward the house with the particular walk of someone who had not yet seen their territory but was already beginning to understand it. She hadn't asked for a tour. She hadn't asked for guidance. She had simply arrived and begun. He stood there for another moment after she'd gone inside, his hat in his hands, and Dell came to stand beside him. "Huh," Dell said. Luke put his hat back on. "Yeah. She's not what I expected." "No," Luke said. "She's not what I expected either." He went inside. The house was quiet, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at an angle that lit the dust in the air like something almost beautiful. And Abigail Carter, Abigail Maddox, now by law, if not yet by anything else, was already standing at the desk in the corner, pulling out a ledger, looking for what needed to be understood. He watched her for a moment. She didn't know about the way he had watched that smile she hadn't known he'd seen. Then he went to hang up his coat and figure out what came next. The ledger she pulled from the desk that first afternoon was 3 years old and smelled like dust and neglect. And by the time Luke came back into the house an hour later, Abigail had filled 4 pages of her own notebook with figures he hadn't known existed. She didn't say anything about it that night. She made a simple supper from what she found in the kitchen. Nothing elaborate, nothing that announced itself. Set a plate in front of him, sat across from him, and ate her own meal in the particular quiet of someone whose mind was working on something entirely separate from the conversation they weren't having. Luke watched her without appearing to watch her. He had expected awkwardness. He had expected the strained performance of 2 strangers pretending a table between them was natural. He had not expected this, her complete self-possession, the way she occupied her own silence, without filling it with anything unnecessary. He said, "The ranch hands eat in the bunkhouse." "I know. I introduced myself to them before supper." He paused. "All of them. There are 7. I have all their names." She looked up. "Cody Pruitt is the youngest. He's 19. He's been skipping breakfast most mornings because he wakes up late and doesn't want to ask for anything. I left a covered plate on the bunkhouse step." Luke set down his fork. "He didn't ask me to do that," she said. "I just noticed." He looked at her for a moment. She had been on his ranch for 6 hours. "You noticed in 6 hours," he said. "I noticed quickly," she said, and went back to her supper. She was up before him the next morning, which he discovered when he came into the kitchen at 5:15 and found coffee already made and Abigail at the desk with the ledger open and her notebook beside it. She had a pencil behind her ear and ink on her left hand and the focused stillness of someone deep inside a problem. "What did you find?" he said. She looked up. "Sit down." He poured his coffee and sat. She turned the notebook toward him. "Your feed supplier has been overcharging you," she said. "Not dramatically, nothing that would jump out if you weren't looking for it. A percentage point here, an adjusted rate there. Over 3 years it totals," she tapped a figure, $412. He stared at the number. "That's not possible. It's documented on every invoice. I can show you exactly where the adjustments appear. It's not an accident. Someone made those adjustments deliberately." She paused. "Your previous arrangement, did your father set up the feed contract before he died?" "Yes." "And you've been running on the same contract ever since?" "I haven't had reason to look at it. I know, that's why they've been doing it." She pulled the invoices into a neat stack. "The contract has an automatic renewal clause. Every January it renews, and the rate gets adjusted for market conditions. There's no cap, no oversight." Luke was quiet for a moment. He picked up the top invoice and looked at it. The numbers were exactly what she said they were. He had signed these invoices himself, year after year, and never seen it. "I've been paying for $400 I didn't owe," he said. "Over 3 years." "Yes." He set the invoice down with careful deliberateness. "Who else knows about this?" "No one. I found it this morning. I haven't spoken to anyone." She looked at him directly. "It's your ranch. What you do with this information is your decision. I'm just telling you what I found." He looked at her across the table. She had been in his house for less than 24 hours, and she had found something he had missed for 3 years. She was not presenting it as an accusation. She was not presenting it as a performance of her usefulness. She was simply telling him the truth, because the truth was what she had found, and she had no other way of operating. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and closed the notebook. "I'll have the full summary ready by Thursday. Every account I can access. You should know everything that's happening on this ranch." "Abigail." She looked up. "That's your ranch too," he said. "Same as the agreement says." Something moved through her expression quick there and gone too fast to name. She picked up her pencil. "Then we should both know what's happening on it." By Thursday, she had the summary. By the following Monday, she had contacted the feed supplier by letter, citing specific invoice numbers, and requesting a formal accounting of all rate adjustments for the past 36 months. She had written the letter herself in language precise enough to make clear that she understood exactly what she was looking at, and Luke had read it twice before she sent it. He'd had a lawyer draw up 2 contracts in his life. Neither of them had been written this cleanly. "Where did you learn to write like this?" he said. She was sealing the envelope. "My father was a county assessor. I helped him with correspondence from the time I was 12. A pause. "He also taught me that the way you phrase a demand determines whether the other person believes you'll follow through on it." "And will you?" She looked at him. "Always." He believed her. The response from the feed supplier came 9 days later. It was 2 pages of careful language that said very little and confirmed nothing, written in the tone of a man who had been caught at something and was hoping to wait out the discomfort. Abigail read it at breakfast and set it down with the particular expression she wore when something had confirmed her expectations. "He's going to wait and see if we push," she said. "Then we push," Luke said. "That's what I think, too." She folded the letter. "I'm going to write to the county commerce office. There's a dispute resolution process for agricultural contracts. It's slow, but it creates a formal record. Once there's a formal record, the supplier loses the ability to simply deny the adjustments." Del Sutter had come in for the morning briefing and was standing at the kitchen door with his coffee, pretending to look out the window and not quite succeeding in hiding the fact that he was listening. "Del," Abigail said without turning around. He looked at her. "Ma'am, you've dealt with the feed supplier directly before. Is there anyone at the county office you have a relationship with? Someone who handles commercial disputes?" Del was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who gave compliments easily or changed his opinion of people quickly, and for the past week he had been watching Abigail Carter with the careful skepticism of a man who had decided to wait for evidence before he decided what he thought. "Tom Radley," he said. "He and I go back. He's fair. Would you be willing to put in a word before I file, just to establish that this is a legitimate grievance from a working ranch, not a complaint from someone who doesn't understand the system?" Del looked at Luke. Luke looked back at him with the expression of a man who was also waiting to see what Del would decide. Del said, "I can do that." "Thank you." She picked up her pen. "I'll have the filing ready tomorrow morning." Del caught Luke's eye again on his way out the door. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look said everything that a man like Del Sutter communicated without words. She knows what she's doing. Luke nodded once. He already knew. 2 weeks in the ranch had a rhythm that Luke hadn't expected and couldn't entirely account for. It was not the rhythm of a man living alone, which had its own shape, irregular, functional, stripped of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. This was different. Meals happened at consistent times. The household accounts were organized into a system he could actually read. There was coffee made before he woke up. There were small repairs attended to that he had been meaning to get to for months. None of it was performed for his benefit. That was the thing that kept striking him. Abigail wasn't trying to demonstrate her value. She was simply doing what she assessed needed to be done, and then doing it with the quiet efficiency of someone who found disorder personally offensive and had no interest in leaving it in place. The ranch hands had noticed. He could tell by the way they talked around her, careful at first, then less careful, then gradually, with the particular ease of people who have decided they trust someone. Cody Pruitt had started showing up for breakfast on time. The older hands had started leaving questions for her that they used to bring to Dell, small things, domestic things, questions about supply orders and meal schedules. And she answered them directly and without condescension, and they went away satisfied. It was Hank Bauer who pushed first. Hank was 47, had been on the Maddox ranch for 11 years, and had a specific relationship with his own opinions that did not include the possibility of being wrong. He came into the kitchen on a Wednesday morning while Abigail was going over the week's supply list and said, "I need the kitchen storeroom key. I'm taking the good rope." Abigail looked up. "For what purpose?" Hank blinked. No one had ever asked him that before. "Fence repair, lower pasture." "How much rope do you need?" "I don't know. Enough." "There are 40 feet on the secondary spool in the equipment shed. That should be sufficient for the lower pasture fence line, unless the damage is more extensive than it was last week. If it is, come back and tell me, and I'll open the storeroom." Hank stared at her. He was not a man accustomed to being managed, and his face said so clearly. "I've been running this ranch for 11 years, he said. "I know," Abigail said pleasantly. "That's why I trust your assessment of whether 40 feet will be enough. If it isn't, you'll tell me." Hank stood there for another 3 seconds. Then he turned around and went to the equipment shed. Luke, who had been standing at the counter pouring coffee and staying very still, waited until the door closed before he said anything. "That was well handled." "He's not a bad man," Abigail said without looking up from her list. "He just needed to understand that I'm not asking his permission to manage the household. I'm asking for his help with it. There's a difference." Luke thought about that for a moment. Most people don't see that difference. Most people don't need to. She turned a page. Hank does. 40 minutes later, Hank Bauer came back from the lower pasture. He stood at the kitchen door. He did not look at Abigail directly. 38 feet was enough, he said. "Good," she said. He nodded once, turned around and left. Luke watched him go. He was starting to understand that watching Abigail work was a form of education he hadn't signed up for, and was getting anyway. 3 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived from the county school board. Abigail read it at the kitchen table without any change in her expression, folded it carefully, and put it in her notebook. Luke had seen that particular stillness before. It was the stillness she used when something required controlled reaction. "What is it?" he said. She looked up. "There's a petition. 17 signatures from families in the district. They're requesting a formal review of my fitness to continue as the county relief coordinator on the grounds that my recent marriage represents a conflict of interest." She paused. "And they've also filed a separate petition questioning my involvement with the schoolhouse." "What involvement with the schoolhouse?" "I've been helping with reading instruction on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. 3 of the ranch family's children needed extra support, and the schoolteacher, Miss Hale, asked if I had time. I've been going for 2 weeks." He hadn't known. He looked at her steadily. 17 signatures. "Yes." "Who led it?" She was quiet for a moment. "The letter doesn't specify, but the first name on the list is Helena Marsh." He knew the name. Helena Marsh was Walter Marsh's wife. Walter Marsh owned the largest competing cattle operation in the county, and had been on the wrong side of a land boundary dispute with the Maddox Ranch for 6 years. "This isn't about conflict of interest," he said. "No," Abigail agreed. "It isn't. They're going after your position because going after me directly is harder." She was quiet again, and he could see her working through it, not emotionally, but tactically, turning the problem in her mind the way she turned every problem, looking for its actual shape. "There's a formal hearing process," she said. "If a petition reaches the board, they're required to hold a review. I have 14 days to respond." "What do you need?" She looked at him. He had said it directly without qualification. "What do you need?" Not, "What can I do?" or "I'm sorry this is happening." Just a straight question about what came next. "Documentation," she said. Letters from families who can speak to my work at the relief office and at the schoolhouse. A clear accounting of my professional record." She paused. "And I need the board to understand that this petition is motivated by a land dispute, not by any legitimate concern about my work." "I can speak to that last part." "I know you can, but I want to make sure that when you do, it's on the basis of facts, not on the basis of being my husband. The board needs to see that this is a documented grievance, not a man defending his wife." He looked at her for a long moment. Most people told that their marriage was being weaponized against them would have been angry. Some would have been afraid. She was neither. She was sitting at his kitchen table in the late afternoon light, analyzing her situation with the precision of someone who trusted their own preparation more than their own feelings, and he found that he trusted it too. "Tell me what you need documented," he said. "I'll start making calls." She opened her notebook to a clean page. "All right, let's start with the Caldwell family. Their son Thomas was 2 years behind in his reading. I've been working with him for 11 days. Where is he now?" Something crossed her face, the briefest warmth gone almost as quickly as it came. He read a full paragraph out loud yesterday for the first time in his life. He looked up at me when he finished and said, "I did it, Miss Abigail." A pause. "He's 6 years old." Luke said nothing for a moment. The weight of that image, a 6-year-old boy reading his first full paragraph, sat in the kitchen between them with more presence than anything either of them could have put into words. "I'll call on the Caldwells tomorrow morning," he said. She nodded and wrote it down. Tiens, he did more than call on the Caldwells. Over the next 5 days, Luke Maddox drove to 9 different families across the county. Families who used the relief office, families whose children attended the schoolhouse, families who knew Abigail's work in ways that had nothing to do with land disputes or competing cattle operations. He went without announcing himself in advance. He asked direct questions, and he listened to the answers, and what he heard at every single door was a variation of the same thing. She had helped them. She had helped them without condescension, and without bureaucratic distance, and without ever making them feel like a problem to be processed. She had extended credit timelines when harvests failed and families couldn't pay. She had caught errors in county records that had been costing small homesteaders money for years. She had shown up on her own time with practical solutions that no one had asked for, and everyone needed. He had married her because he needed a signature on a contract. He drove home on the 5th evening with 9 letters in his jacket pocket, and he sat in the wagon for a moment after he pulled up to the house, looking at the window where the kitchen light was burning. He had not paid attention to Abigail Carter before. He had known her name the way everyone knew her name, as a label, as a category, as the county coordinator, and the woman nobody married. He had never once considered what she did with her days, what she was building in the world, what mattered to her. He was considering it now. She was at the desk when he came in. She looked up, and he held out the letters. 9, he said. She took them from him and looked at the stack. Something moved through her face, not surprise, but something quieter. Not the composure she wore like armor. Something underneath it, something that looked like relief, and under that something that looked like gratitude, that had nowhere comfortable to go. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The hearing is in 9 days. I want to go over every single thing they might raise before we walk in that room." She looked at him directly, and in her eyes was an expression he hadn't seen from her yet. Clear and steady. Yes, as always. But with something behind it that was less guarded than usual. Something that had decided, maybe for the first time, that it was safe to rely on someone other than herself. "Then sit down," she said. "We have work to do." He pulled out the chair across from her. They worked until midnight. The night before the board hearing, Abigail didn't sleep. Luke knew because he didn't sleep either, and at 2 a.m, he heard the creak of the kitchen chair and the quiet scratch of her pencil, and he lay in the dark on his side of the house, listening to the sounds of her preparing. And he did not go in because she hadn't asked him to, and she was not a woman who wanted to be rescued from her own work. But at 3:15, he got up anyway, and he put the coffee on, and he carried 2 cups to the kitchen doorway, and set one on the corner of her desk without a word. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." She held his gaze for a moment, then picked up the coffee. "I keep finding things I want to add. You have 9 letters, a 3-year professional record, and the most organized documentation I have ever seen in my life." He sat down across from her. "What are you finding?" "Gaps. Things they might raise that I haven't addressed." She turned the notebook toward him. "Helena Marsh's husband filed a complaint against the relief office 18 months ago. It was dismissed, but it's on record. They're going to bring it up." "What was the complaint?" "He claimed I had denied his application for drought relief unfairly. The truth is that the Marsh operation earned 4 times the income threshold for emergency relief that year. He applied anyway because he thought the threshold didn't apply to him." She paused. "I denied it because the law requires me to deny it." "So you followed the law?" "Yes, but he's going to present it tomorrow as evidence that I have a personal bias against his family. And the board members who don't know the details of his application won't know the difference between a legitimate complaint and a man who's angry he didn't get something he wasn't entitled to." Luke looked at her notebook. She had the complaint document, the income record, the statutory threshold, and a side-by-side comparison all laid out in clean columns. Anyone who read it would understand the facts in 30 seconds. "They'll read it," he said. "Some of them will. Others will hear Walter Marsh speak first and make up their minds before they look at a single document." She pulled the notebook back. "That's how these things work." He knew she was right. He also knew something she hadn't said, and he said it now quietly, directly. "Abigail, are you afraid?" She was still for a moment, the kind of still that meant she was deciding something. "I'm afraid they'll take my position," she said. "Not because they'll find anything wrong with my work, but because they have the power to, and some of them might use it." She looked up. "I've given 15 years to this county. 15 years of being careful and thorough and present for every family that needed this office. And it might come down to whether Walter Marsh is more persuasive than I am." A pause. "Yes, I'm afraid of that." It was the most unguarded thing she had ever said to him. He could hear the cost of it, a woman who held herself together with precision and composure, telling the truth about fear at 3 in the morning over coffee in her own kitchen, and the fact that she said it to him at all meant something that neither of them named out loud. "Then we make sure," he said, "that the documents speak louder than Walter Marsh." She looked at him steadily. Then she nodded once and turned back to her notebook. They worked until 4:30. Then she went to lie down for 2 hours, and he sat at the kitchen table and thought about 15 years and about a woman who had given them to a county that had spent those same 15 years calling her an old maid. The hearing was held in the courthouse meeting room, the same building where they had married 5 weeks earlier, which Luke noticed and filed away and said nothing about. The school board consisted of 5 members. Chairman Robert Alcott was a banker's man, methodical and fair, but cautious about public controversy. The other 4 were a mixed picture, 2 who had already made up their minds, one who was genuinely undecided, and one Margaret Ellison, who ran the county's only library, who had sent Abigail a personal note of support 2 days earlier. Walter Marsh was already seated when they arrived with Helena beside him and a lawyer Luke didn't recognize from this county at his left elbow. The lawyer had the polished look of someone brought in from Helena specifically for the occasion, and the sight of him landed in Luke's chest like a stone dropping into still water. He felt Abigail's arm tense slightly against his, the one small physical signal she allowed herself, and then it was gone, and she was walking toward her seat at the respondent's table, with her files under her arm, and her spine straight, and her face clear. Del Sutter was in the back row with Frank Aldridge and 2 of the other ranch hands. Luke hadn't asked them to come. They had come anyway. Cody Pruitt was at the end of the row, his hat in his hands, looking like a man at his first formal proceeding, who had decided it was important enough to be there regardless. Abigail saw them. Luke watched her see them. Her expression didn't change, but something in her shoulders settled barely a fraction of an inch in a way that only someone paying very close attention would notice. He had been paying very close attention for 5 weeks. Walter Marsh spoke first. He was a large man with a large voice and the particular confidence of someone who had never in his adult life been told that what he wanted was unavailable. He stood before the board and framed the petition in broad, reasonable-sounding language about conflicts of interest and the importance of impartiality in public office, and every third sentence, he used the phrase, "the integrity of this county," in the tone of a man who had personally invented the concept. He was good at it. Luke had to give him that. If you didn't know the specific facts of every claim he was making, you might believe him. The lawyer from Helena added 3 minutes of legal language that said the same things Marsh had said, but with Latin phrases attached, which seemed to impress 2 of the board members, and visibly irritated Margaret Ellison. Then Robert Alcott turned to Abigail. "Miss Carter, Mrs. Maddox." He paused on the name slightly uncertain which applied. "You may respond." Abigail stood. She did not have notes in her hands. She had her notebook on the table in front of her, but she didn't look at it. She looked at the board. "Thank you, Chairman Alcott." Her voice was level and unhurried. "I want to address each of the specific claims in the petition in the order they were filed, and I want to do it with documentation for every point, so that the board doesn't have to take my word for anything I say." She opened the notebook and removed the first organized set of papers. "Mr. Marsh has claimed that my marriage to Luke Maddox creates a conflict of interest in my role as relief coordinator, because my husband has an active relief contract through this office." She set the papers on the board's table. "That contract was approved 4 days before our marriage under a completely separate application process, reviewed and countersigned by Deputy Coordinator Ellen Hale, not by me. I recused myself from the final approval specifically because I was aware of the pending application. The recusal is documented here, dated and countersigned." Alcott looked at the document. One of the board members leaned over to read it. "Mr. Marsh has also referenced a complaint he filed against this office 18 months ago." She set another document on the table. "That complaint was dismissed on review. The reason for dismissal is documented. Mr. Marsh's operation reported a gross annual income of $42,000 in the year he applied for emergency drought relief. The statutory income threshold for that relief category is $10,000. The denial was not a judgment call. It was a legal requirement." A pause. "I would also note that the same standard was applied to every application that year. There were no exceptions made in any direction for any applicant." The room was very quiet. Walter Marsh shifted in his seat. The lawyer from Helena wrote something on his notepad. Abigail kept going. She moved through each point of the petition with the same method: claim, document, context, fact, and she never once raised her voice or showed irritation, and she never once said anything that could be characterized as personal or defensive. She was presenting a case. She was presenting it the way a woman who had spent 15 years doing precise, careful work under public scrutiny knew how to present a case with the facts arranged so clearly that the only way to argue with them was to argue with arithmetic. When she got to the school board petition, she paused for the first time. Not from uncertainty, from deliberateness. "The second petition questions my involvement with reading instruction at the county schoolhouse. I want to be transparent about that involvement." She reached into the notebook and produced 9 envelopes. "These are letters from 9 families in this county. I did not solicit them. They were gathered independently by my husband, who visited each family personally without my knowledge and asked them to write what they chose to write." She set the envelopes on the table. "I have not read all of them. I don't know exactly what they say, but I know what I did for those families, and I trust that they've described it accurately." Alcott opened the first envelope. He read. He passed it to the member on his left. The room was still. Margaret Ellison had already reached for a letter. She read the first paragraph, and her jaw tightened in the way a woman's jaw tightens when she is hearing something that confirms what she already knew and is angry it ever needed confirming. Marsh's lawyer stood. "Chairman, we'd like to—" "Sit down, please," Alcott said, without looking up from the letter he was reading. The lawyer sat down. Luke watched Walter Marsh's face and watched the moment specific, measurable, when the man understood that the hearing was not going the way he had planned it. It was the testimony from Thomas Caldwell's mother that changed the room. She had not been announced. She was not on any list. She was a small woman named Clara Caldwell, who had driven herself into town in a wagon that had 2 cracked spokes and a missing wheel brace, and she stood up from the public gallery without being called and said in a voice that shook only slightly, "I'd like to speak if the board will allow it." Alcott looked up. "Mrs. Caldwell, my son Thomas is 6 years old. He couldn't read a single word when school started this year, not his own name, not a simple sign. His teacher, Miss Hale, she tried her best, but there are 22 children in that room, and Thomas needs more time than 22 children allows for." She stopped, took a breath. Mrs. Maddox started coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays 3 weeks ago. She sat with Thomas every single time. She brought different books. She tried different ways of showing him the letters when one way didn't work. Another pause. Last Thursday, Thomas read a paragraph out loud, his first one. He came home and read it to me at the supper table. He read it 3 times because he wanted to make sure I heard it. The room was absolutely silent. "I don't know anything about conflicts of interest or legal thresholds," Clara Caldwell said. "I know that my little boy can read his name now, and I know who sat with him until he could." She looked at the board. "I'd hate to see this county lose that." She sat down. Margaret Ellison was not crying. She was a composed woman who had run a county library for 20 years and had long practice at not crying in public. But her eyes were bright, and her jaw was set, and when she looked at Walter Marsh, it was with the specific expression of a woman who had fully made up her mind. Luke looked at Abigail. She was sitting very still, her hands folded on the notebook in front of her, her face clear. But her throat moved once in a quiet swallow, and her eyes, just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, went bright before she blinked it back. He had seen her hold herself together through 5 weeks of scrutiny and pressure, and a town that had never once decided to be kind to her. He had never seen her come that close to the edge of it. He reached under the table and put his hand over hers. She went still for a half-second. Then slowly she turned her hand over under his, and her fingers closed around his, and she held on. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. They both kept their eyes forward on the board. But her grip was firm and steady, and it stayed. The board deliberated for 22 minutes. Luke counted them from the hard wooden chair in the hallway where he and Abigail waited side by side, not speaking. Del Sutter paced. Cody Pruitt sat against the wall with his hat turning in his hands like a wheel. Frank Aldridge had his arms crossed, and the expression of a man prepared to be angry on somebody else's behalf if necessary. Walter Marsh and his lawyer waited at the other end of the hallway. Marsh had stopped looking at people directly. His wife Helena had said nothing since the hearing began, which Luke suspected was somewhat unusual for her. At minute 19, Abigail said quietly, "Whatever they decide." Luke looked at her. "Whatever they decide what? I mean, I've done everything I could do. The documents are accurate. The letters are genuine. I said everything true." She paused. "If they vote against me anyway, it won't be because I didn't try." "They won't vote against you." "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I know what those letters said, and I know what Clara Caldwell said, and I know that Margaret Ellison looked at Walter Marsh like she was considering options." Something flickered in Abigail's face. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one. "She did look at him that way," she said. "Fairly directly," Luke said. The precursor became something small and real, and for just a moment the tension in her face broke open into something lighter, and she laughed quiet, brief, almost silent, and pressed her free hand to her mouth. It was the first time he had ever heard her laugh. It wasn't a performance. It was just the honest sound of a person briefly released from pressure, and it was the most unguarded thing he had ever heard from her, and it hit him somewhere completely unprepared. The door opened. Robert Alcott stepped into the hallway. The laugh was gone. Abigail stood. Alcott looked at her with the measured expression of a careful man about to say something he had chosen precisely. "Mrs. Maddox," he said, The board has reached a decision. The vote was 4-1. 4 in favor of dismissing the petition, 1 against a board member named Gerald Pruitt, who was distantly related to Walter Marsh by marriage and had apparently decided that was more relevant than the 9 letters, or Clara Caldwell, or the documented income threshold. Alcott announced it in the flat official tone of a man reading a finding. And when he got to the word dismissed, something went through the hallway like a pressure releasing. Del Sutter made a sound under his breath that was not quite a word, but was entirely unambiguous. Cody Pruitt said yes out loud, and then looked embarrassed about it. Frank Aldridge uncrossed his arms. Abigail stood without moving for 1 full second. Then she said, "Thank you, Chairman Alcott," in the same level voice she'd used throughout. And she turned and shook Margaret Ellison's hand, when Ellison came directly to her, and she said something to Ellison that Luke didn't hear, and Ellison gripped her hand with both of hers and held it. Luke stood back and let her have it. She had earned every second of it, and it belonged to her. Walter Marsh left without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed him. Helena Marsh paused at the door, and for a single, unreadable moment, she looked at Abigail, not with hostility, Luke thought, but with something more complicated. Something that looked almost like acknowledgement. Then she walked out. Clara Caldwell found Abigail before the room had fully cleared and took both her hands and said something that made Abigail bend her head slightly forward, the way a person bends their head when they are receiving something they didn't expect and don't quite know how to carry. Luke watched all of it. He watched the woman his county had labeled and dismissed and passed over for 15 years. Receive in this hard wooden room a fraction of what she was owed, and he felt something in his chest that was not simple and was not comfortable and was not going to go away. Del came to stand beside him. "You know," Del said in the tone of a man making a reluctant admission, "when you told me you were getting married, I thought you'd lost your mind." "I know. I thought it was the contract talking." It was. Del was quiet for a moment. "It isn't anymore, is it?" Luke watched Abigail thank Clara Caldwell. He watched her straighten up and take a breath and look around the room with the clear, steady gaze of a woman who had just fought for herself in public and won and was already thinking about what came next. "No," he said. "It isn't." Del nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something he suspected has been confirmed by evidence he trusts. On the way back to the wagon, Abigail was quiet. Not the closed quiet of someone processing hurt. The open quiet of someone who has set something down that they'd been carrying too long. She walked beside him through the courthouse door into the afternoon, and the light hit her face, and she lifted her chin slightly the way she always did when she was stepping into something she'd decided to meet head-on. At the wagon, he helped her up and she let him, which was itself something because in 5 weeks she had almost never let him help her with anything she could manage alone. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, and the horses started moving, and the courthouse fell behind them. After a long moment, she said, "Thank you for the letters." "You already thanked me. I'm thanking you again, because I read them on the way in this morning." She looked straight ahead. "You went to 9 families, and you asked them to write about me, and they did. And what they wrote—" She stopped, cleared her throat. "What they wrote was true. And having someone go find the truth about you instead of just believing the story that's easier," she stopped again. She was not going to cry. She had spent 15 years not crying about this particular thing. And she was not going to start now in a wagon on a county road with a man who had been her husband for 5 weeks. But her voice had been different in those 2 sentences than he had ever heard it before. "Abigail," he said, "I'm fine. I know you are." He kept his eyes on the road. "I just want you to know that the 9 families weren't difficult to find. Every single one of them had something to say before I finished asking." He paused. "It wasn't hard to find the truth about you. It was just a matter of looking." She didn't answer. But beside him in the late afternoon, she let out a slow breath. The kind of breath a person lets out when a weight they've been carrying for so long they'd stopped noticing it finally shifts, and she did not say anything else, and neither did he. The ranch road came up ahead. He turned the horses toward home. The feed supplier's letter arrived 4 days after the hearing, and this time it was not 2 pages of careful evasion. It was a single paragraph and a check, $419. 7 more than Abigail had calculated, which meant there had been an additional adjustment she hadn't yet found, and the fact that the supplier had included it without being asked told Luke everything he needed to know about how seriously they had taken her filing with the county commerce office. He set the check on the desk in front of her without comment. She looked at it. She looked at the letter. She set the letter down. He added $7, she said. I noticed. That means there's an invoice I didn't find. She was already pulling the folder. I want to know which one. Abigail. He put his hand on the folder before she could open it. We got the money back. We won. You're allowed to let it be finished. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who had never in her life let anything be finished before she understood it completely. I want to know which invoice. He lifted his hand. All right. She found it in 11 minutes. It was from 2 years ago, a single adjusted line on a quarterly statement, 43 cents per unit, across a bulk order totaling $7 and change. She circled it in pencil, noted it in her log, and closed the folder. There, she said. Feel better. Yes. She looked at him with the particular directness that he had come to understand was not defiance, but simply her natural mode of looking at the world. I know that seems excessive to you. It seems thorough. It is thorough. I don't like loose ends. A pause. My father used to say that a loose end is just a problem that hasn't announced itself yet. Luke sat down across from her. He sounds like he was a careful man. He was. He was also wrong sometimes, and he was always willing to say so. She leaned back slightly, a small physical ease she'd developed in recent weeks, a loosening in how she held herself in this house. He would have liked this ranch. It was the first time she had mentioned her father in anything other than a practical context, and the way she said it quietly without armor told him that the man was gone, and the loss was old, but it still had weight. When did you lose him? He said. 8 years ago. He had a bad heart. We knew it was coming, and it came anyway. She was quiet for a moment. After that, it was just me. I had the relief position and the house and my work, and that was... She stopped. That was enough. I told myself it was enough. The kitchen was very still. Luke looked at her across the table at the woman who had spent 8 years telling herself that solitude and purpose added up to a complete life. And he thought about the 15 years before that, and the town that had watched her build that life and called it a failure. Was it? He said. She met his eyes. Most of the time, she said honestly. He nodded. She looked at him for another moment, then reached for the check and stood up. I'll deposit this Thursday. I want to apply it directly to the operating debt, not the general account. That's exactly what I would have done, he said. I know, she said. And there was something in her voice when she said it, something that recognized him, that had been paying attention, the way he'd been paying attention. And she went to file the folder, and he sat there for a moment, thinking about what it meant when two people started finishing each other's practical sentences. Del Sutter had a theory which he shared with Frank Aldridge one morning in the equipment shed with the directness of a man who considered observation a form of work. He's different, Del said. Frank was fixing a harness and did not look up. Different how? Steadier. Less. Del searched for the word. Coiled. Frank looked up now. Coiled. Luke has always been wound up tight, not angry. Just ready for something to go wrong, like he was waiting for the next problem. Del picked up a wrench he didn't need. He's not doing that as much anymore. Frank considered this. She's not what I expected, he said, which was the closest Frank Aldridge came to a strong opinion about anything. No, Del said. She's not what anyone expected. What neither of them said, but both knew, was that the ranch felt different too. Not softer. Softer was the wrong word. More organized. More intentional. like a machine that had been running slightly out of alignment for years and had finally been adjusted by someone who understood the mechanics. The feed contracts were resolved. The supply accounts were clean. The bunkhouse had a posted meal schedule for the first time in 11 years, which Cody Pruitt had taped to the wall himself, and which the older hands pretended to find unnecessary while consulting it every morning. Hank Bauer had stopped challenging Abigail's decisions 2 weeks ago, not because she had confronted him again, but because she had done something more effective. She had asked his opinion about the spring supply order. Specifically, she had sat down with him and said, "You've been on this ranch for 11 years. I've been here for 6 weeks. Tell me what I'm missing." And Hank, who had never in his life been consulted on anything beyond fence repair and cattle management, had talked for 45 minutes and told her things about the ranch's patterns and needs that were not in any ledger anywhere, and she had written every word down and incorporated 3 of his suggestions into the new supply plan. He had not challenged her once after that. She had not announced this to Luke. He found out from Cody, who had witnessed the conversation, and mentioned it in the tone of a 19-year-old reporting something he found both surprising and impressive. That evening, Luke had looked at Abigail across the supper table and said, "You asked Hank for his opinion." "Of course I did," she said. "He knows things I don't know. That's not a problem, it's a resource. Most people would have just waited for him to stop pushing. That would have taken months, and I would have lost information I need." She passed him the bread. "It's not complicated, Luke." "Abigail," he said, "most things that look simple aren't." She looked at him steadily. "And most things that look complicated are just things people haven't bothered to think through." He ate his bread and thought about that for the rest of the evening. The letter from the state agricultural office came on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the hearing, and it was not addressed to Luke. It was addressed to Abigail Carter Maddox, and it was a formal commendation from the State Director of Rural Relief Operations, acknowledging the Harlan County office's record of 0 processing errors over the past 3 years, and specifically citing the coordinator's work in dispute resolution and resource allocation. It had been written, the director's note explained, in response to a recommendation submitted by Margaret Ellison and countersigned by 7 county residents. Abigail read it at the kitchen table, while Luke watched her face. She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it down with the particular deliberateness of someone trying to decide how to hold something unexpected. "Did you know about this?" she said. "No." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "Margaret Ellison," she said. "Must be." She looked back at the letter. Something moved through her face. Not the carefully controlled gratitude he had seen her deploy in public, but something rawer and less managed, the genuine version of what it felt like to be seen by people who didn't have to see you. "She didn't tell me she was doing this." "People don't usually announce it when they're doing something on your behalf," Luke said. "They just do it." She looked at him when he said that, and the look had a particular quality to it, a recognition, a connecting of dots. He had gone to 9 families without telling her. Margaret Ellison had filed a commendation without telling her. The ranch hands had quietly rearranged themselves around her competence, without fanfare or announcement. A woman who had spent 15 years earning things she had to fight for was beginning to encounter the different experience of people simply deciding she deserved them. "I don't know what to do with this," she said quietly. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "You can just have it." She looked at him for a long moment, then she folded the letter again and stood up. "I'm going to write to Director Barnes and thank him, and I'm going to find a way to thank Margaret that doesn't involve showing up at the library and crying." "Will you cry?" "Absolutely not," she said firmly, and left the room. Luke sat at the table alone for a moment, smiling at nothing in particular. The first real argument happened on a Thursday in the 4th week after the hearing, which put them at 10 weeks of marriage, and it started the way arguments between careful people always start, with a decision that one person made alone, that the other person believed should have been made together. Abigail had extended a credit line to the Morrison family without telling him first. The Morrisons were a homesteading family 12 miles out whose winter wheat had failed 2 seasons running. James Morrison had come to the relief office on Tuesday while Abigail was working her regular hours, and he had come in the particular hunched posture of a man who had already prepared himself to be told no. His family owed 2 months of supply debt to the general store, and his oldest daughter had been kept home from school to help with the work because they couldn't manage otherwise. Abigail had extended a 60-day relief credit from the county office's emergency fund, which was within her legal authority to do. She had also, without going through the office, told James Morrison that the Maddox ranch had a standing order of day labor for spring fence work, and that his oldest son was welcome to come by on Saturdays for paid work. She told Luke about it Thursday evening, presenting it as information rather than a request for approval, and he had been quiet for a moment before he said, "You committed ranch labor without asking me." "The work needs doing. Hank has been saying so for a month. I found someone who needs the income." "That's my call to make, Abigail. The work is ranch work. The budget for day labor is in the operating account. I looked at the account. Looking at the account doesn't give you authority to make hiring decisions." She met his eyes. "You're right," she said, and the directness of it, no softening, no deflection, just a clean acknowledgement, momentarily disarmed him. "That was your decision to make, and I made it without asking. I should have come to you first." He had been ready for a longer argument. He regrouped. "Why didn't you?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, working toward an honest answer. "Because I was afraid you'd say no. And if you'd said no, I would have had to look at James Morrison and tell him there was no work available. And he was already—" She stopped. "He came in expecting to be told no. I could see it. And I didn't want to add to that." Luke was quiet. "That's not a good reason," she said. "Bypassing your authority because I anticipated a decision I disagreed with. That's not the agreement we made." "No," he said. "It isn't. I'll tell you before I do anything that commits ranch resources going forward, even if I'm confident it's the right decision." She looked at him steadily. "But I want you to know that I think it was the right decision." "I know you do." He looked at her. For what it's worth, it probably was. Hank has been wanting that fence work done for 6 weeks, and Morrison's boy knows that land. A pause. "But I still need to be in the conversation." "I understand. This is your ranch too, but we run it together. That means together." She nodded. Together. It was the most direct conversation they had ever had about what their arrangement actually was, not what the document said, not what the law required, but what they had been building in this house daily and incrementally, without either of them naming it. They didn't name it now either, but the word together stayed in the room after the conversation ended. Morrison's son showed up Saturday morning. His name was Patrick. He was 17, and he worked harder than any man on the ranch that day, except possibly Luke himself. At noon, Abigail brought lunch to the fence line, not just for Patrick, but for all of them, which she had apparently decided warranted a full spread, and Patrick Morrison ate 3 helpings and said, "Thank you, ma'am," so many times that Cody Pruitt started counting. James Morrison came by in the afternoon to check on his son, and he found Luke and stood at the fence line looking at the work Patrick had done and said, "My boy did that." "He did," Luke said. Morrison was quiet for a moment. "Miss Abigail, Mrs. Maddox. She's something." Luke watched Patrick working. "Yeah," he said. "She is. My wife wanted me to say, Ruth wanted me to say that what she did for us, the way she talked to us in that office like we were people with dignity and not just a problem to be sorted, Ruth wanted you to tell her that." Luke looked at him. "Tell her yourself." "I'd be too embarrassed." "James," Luke said, "that woman has been told all her life that she's not enough. If Ruth wants to say something true to her, don't let embarrassment get in the way of it." Morrison looked at him with the slightly startled expression of a man who had been given more honesty than he expected. Then he nodded. "I'll send Ruth by." Ruth Morrison came by the following Tuesday and spent an hour at the kitchen table with Abigail, and left with red eyes that were clearly not from sadness. Abigail did not tell Luke what they talked about. He didn't ask. Some conversations belonged only to the people who had them. But that evening she was quieter than usual, and it was not the quiet of someone keeping something back. It was the quiet of someone who had been given something they hadn't expected and was figuring out where to put it. The twist that changed everything did not announce itself. It arrived in an ordinary envelope on an ordinary morning, and it was from a lawyer in Billings. Luke opened it at the kitchen table while Abigail was pouring coffee. He read it once. He read it again. The second time, his face changed in a way that Abigail caught from across the kitchen, and she set the coffee pot down. "Luke." He looked up. "It's about the land." She came to the table. The letter was from an attorney representing a man named Gerald Foss, who claimed to hold a prior deed to the eastern 40 acres of the Maddox homestead, the same 40 acres where Luke's grandfather had built the original fence line, the same 40 acres that had been in the Maddox family for 61 years. Foss claimed his father had purchased the land in 1887 from the original Territorial Land Office, and that the subsequent Maddox claim had been registered in error. He was requesting a formal land review and boundary arbitration. Abigail read it. She read it twice the same way Luke had. "This is Walter Marsh," she said. Luke looked at her. "It's Gerald Foss." "Gerald Foss," she said, "is Walter Marsh's brother-in-law." She set the letter down. "I processed a county records request 6 weeks ago. Someone was pulling original land deeds from 1885 to 1892. I didn't think much of it at the time. Records requests are routine." She paused. "It was filed under Foss's name." Luke was very still. "He's been planning this since before the hearing. Probably since you filed the relief contract." She looked at him. "You're a larger operation now with a legal contract and documented assets. If the Eastern 40 is successfully disputed, the relief contract may need to be renegotiated. You'd lose grazing land and potentially trigger a reassessment of the whole claim. He couldn't beat us at the hearing, so he's going after the land." "Yes." She picked up the letter. "But he made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He pulled those records while I was still the coordinator of this office. I have a copy of every records request filed in the past 12 months. I can document exactly when he started looking for this, which means I can establish premeditation. This isn't a legitimate land dispute. It's a coordinated strategy, and I can prove the sequence." Luke looked at her. The woman across from him had just turned a legal ambush into a documented case in approximately 90 seconds. "How long will it take to pull the documentation?" he said. "I already have most of it filed. Give me 2 days." "We'll need a lawyer. Tom Radley at the county office knows property law. He's fair and he's thorough. Dell already said he and Tom go back." She paused. "And I want to write to Director Barnes at the State Agricultural Office. The relief contract creates a state-level interest in this land claim. If Foss is attempting to destabilize an active state relief contract, that's not just a local matter." Luke sat back. He had received a legal ambush that morning, and his wife had already outmaneuvered it in the time it took him to read the letter twice. He thought about how he had sat in the feed store with Earl Gibbs, listening to a marriage condition he'd found absurd. He thought about the courthouse and the crowd and the ring in his jacket pocket that he hadn't known was there. He thought about how he had driven to this office with his hat in his hand expecting to solve a problem, and how that problem had turned out to be a woman sitting behind a desk who saw things other people missed and moved toward difficulty the way other people moved away from it. "Abigail," he said. She was already reaching for her notebook. "Yes." "I want to say something." She looked up. "When Earl Gibbs told me about the marriage condition, I was angry. I drove to your office thinking I was going to solve a problem. I thought you were the practical part of a legal requirement." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand now how wrong that was. Not as an apology, as a fact." She looked at him with the steady, clear gaze that never performed anything it didn't mean. "I know what I signed up for," she said. "I had my own reasons for agreeing." "What were they?" She was quiet for a moment. It was not evasion. It was the same deliberateness she brought to every true thing she said. "I wanted a life that was more than an office and an empty house," she said. "I knew the terms. I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought that if I could be useful enough, the rest of it might follow." "The rest of what?" She looked at him, and in her eyes was the answer she wasn't quite ready to say out loud. The answer that was true, and that she knew was true, and that sat between them now like a door that hadn't been opened yet, but that both of them knew was there. "The rest of it," she said quietly, "and let that stand." He nodded. He was not going to push a door she wasn't ready to walk through. He understood that about her now, that she moved toward things on her own timeline, and that the things she moved toward with her whole self, and that was worth waiting for. 2 days on the documentation, he said. 2 days, she confirmed. She opened her notebook. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her, and they worked together at the table that had become the center of something neither of them had planned, and both of them had stopped pretending they didn't want. Outside, the ranch moved through its morning, the way it always did now, with the particular steadiness of a place that had found its rhythm. Hank Bauer was at the fence line. Cody Pruitt had eaten breakfast. Patrick Morrison would be back on Saturday. And in the kitchen, Luke Maddox watched Abigail Carter build their defense with the same hands that had first opened a ledger on his desk 10 weeks ago, and he thought, "This is not what I expected." He thought, "I don't know how I would do this without her." He thought, "I'm going to have to say that out loud soon." Not yet, but soon. The land arbitration hearing was scheduled for a Monday, 6 weeks after Gerald Foss's letter arrived. In those 6 weeks, Abigail did not sleep enough and did not complain about it, and Luke watched her build a case the way he had watched her do everything with precision, without performance, moving through the work as though the alternative was not something she entertained. Tom Radley turned out to be exactly what Dell had promised: fair, thorough, and deeply unimpressed by men who used lawyers from other counties to intimidate small homesteaders. He had reviewed the documentation Abigail assembled in 2 days, then looked at her across his desk and said, "How long have you been practicing law?" "I haven't," she said. "Then you've wasted a considerable talent," he said, and got to work. The sequence Abigail had documented was damning in its clarity. Gerald Foss had filed the original records request 11 days after Luke's relief contract was approved, 4 weeks before the school board petition, and 2 days after Walter Marsh had been overheard at the feed store, saying that the Maddox operation had gotten too comfortable. The timing was not coincidence. The timing was a strategy, and the documents proved it was coordinated. Director Barnes at the State Agricultural Office had responded to Abigail's letter within 10 days. His response was 3 pages and contained language about state contract protection and the liability exposure of parties attempting to destabilize active relief agreements, written in the specific tone of a senior official who had decided to be annoyed. He would be sending a representative to the arbitration. Walter Marsh. When he heard about the state representative, reportedly said nothing for a long time, and then told his lawyer to get on the first train from Helena. Luke heard this from Dell, who heard it from Tom Radley, who heard it from someone at the county clerk's office. By the time it reached Luke, it had the quality of information that had been verified at every step. He didn't expect the state to get involved, Luke said. No one expects Abigail to do what Abigail does. Dell said, until she's already done it. The night before the arbitration, Luke found her at the desk again. It was past 11 and the house was quiet, and she had 3 folders open and her notebook beside them and the same pencil behind her ear that had been there since morning. He pulled a chair to the side of the desk and sat down. "Talk me through it," he said. She looked at him. "You know the case." "I want to hear you say it, out loud, all of it." She understood immediately. It was not about information. It was about hearing herself say it with confidence, so that tomorrow, standing in front of an arbitration panel, the words would come from the same place they were coming from now, from certainty, from preparation, from 3 years of documented truth. She talked for 40 minutes. He listened without interrupting, except once to ask a clarifying question, and once to tell her that a particular piece of evidence needed to come earlier in the sequence, because it established motive before everything else landed. She considered it for 30 seconds and said he was right, and reorganized it on the spot. When she finished, he said, "You have it." "I have the documents." You have more than the documents. You understand the shape of what they did. That's what the panel will see tomorrow. Not just paper, but someone who knows exactly how the scheme worked and can explain it to 5 people who've never heard of Gerald Foss. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if the Marsh lawyer is better than I am in the room?" "He might be. He's probably smoother. He's had 20 years of courtroom practice, and you've had 6 weeks of preparation." Luke looked at her directly. "But he doesn't believe what he's arguing. You do. And people can tell the difference." She held his gaze for a moment. In her eyes was the same thing he had seen at 3 in the morning, before the board hearing, the fear that was real and honest, and that she was choosing to act through, rather than let stop her. "Go to sleep," he said. 2 hours at minimum. I'll wake you at 5. "I'm not tired." "I know. Go anyway." She looked at him for another moment. Then she closed the top folder, capped her pen, and stood up. She paused at the doorway of the kitchen, her back to him. "Luke." "Yeah." "I'm glad it was you," she said. "On the other side of that desk. I'm glad it was you who came in." He didn't answer immediately, because the thing she had said hit him in a place that wasn't ready for it. The specific place where a man keeps the truths he hasn't let himself say out loud yet. He sat in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and listened to her go down the hall. And he thought about everything that had been built in this house over 12 weeks, the ledgers and the letters and the arguments and the silent mornings and the coffee made before dawn, and a woman who laughed quietly at 3 in the morning and didn't know he'd heard it. "Me too," he said to the empty kitchen. The arbitration panel was 5 people. The state representative, a composed man named Arthur Weld, who had driven from Billings and had the expression of someone who had seen a great many frivolous disputes in his career and was already forming opinions about this one, sat at the far right. Tom Radley presented the Maddox case. Abigail sat beside him with her folders, and did not fidget, and did not look at Walter Marsh, who was 3 chairs to her left, with his Helena lawyer, and the specifically controlled expression of a man trying not to show that he was worried. Gerald Foss was present. He was a smaller man than Luke expected, with the particular uncomfortable posture of someone who had agreed to put his name on something, and was only now fully understanding what that commitment looked like in a formal room with 5 people and a state representative staring at it. The Foss lawyer opened with the 1887 deed claim, presenting it as a straightforward matter of prior documentation. It was a reasonable-sounding argument if you didn't know what Abigail knew, and Luke watched the panel members' faces and saw 2 of them nodding slightly, following the logic, and felt a cold tightening in his chest. Then Tom Radley stood up. He presented the record's request documentation first. He laid out the date, the filing name, the specific deeds requested, and set it beside a timeline of every other action in the sequence: the relief contract approval, the school board petition, the Foss letter, and he let the panel read it in silence for a full 2 minutes before he said a word. Arthur Weld leaned forward. He picked up the records request document. He looked at the date. He looked at the relief contract approval date. He set both down with the deliberate care of a man who had just seen something he found professionally significant. "Mr. Radley," Weld said, "the records request precedes the letter of claim by 31 days. "It does," Tom said. "And the records request was filed under Mr. Foss's name." "It was, and I would note for the panel that Mr. Foss and Mr. Walter Marsh are brothers-in-law, and that Mr. Marsh has an active boundary dispute with the Maddox property dating to 1919. The Foss lawyer was on his feet. "Objection. This is an arbitration panel, counselor," Weld said pleasantly. "Not a courtroom. Sit down." The lawyer sat down. Luke watched Walter Marsh's face and saw at the specific moment when a man who has been engineering something from a distance realizes that the distance has collapsed and the thing he engineered is now being examined in direct light. Marsh's jaw tightened. His eyes moved just once to Abigail. She was looking at the panel. She had not looked at Marsh once. Abigail was called to speak to the records documentation. She stood, and she did what she had done at the board hearing, presented the evidence in sequence clearly without drama, letting the facts carry their own weight. She explained the records request system, how requests were logged, what the log showed, and what the timing established about the sequence of decisions made over the previous 3 months. She was on her feet for 26 minutes. The panel asked 4 questions. She answered every one of them directly, without consulting her notes. When she sat down, Tom Radley leaned over and said very quietly, "I've worked with lawyers who couldn't do that." She said nothing. But her hands, which had been perfectly still on the table for 26 minutes, relaxed a small unclenching that only someone watching closely would notice. Luke was watching closely. The Foss lawyer attempted a rebuttal that lasted 12 minutes and contained 3 arguments, none of which engaged directly with the timeline documentation, because there was no direct engagement that wouldn't make the situation worse. He was smooth, and he was practiced, and he was arguing a position he didn't believe for a client who had signed his name to someone else's scheme, and the panel looked at him with the polite attention of people who had already made up their minds. Arthur Weld called a 30-minute recess. In the hallway, Luke stood beside Abigail, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Dell was in the back of the room again. So was Cody. So was Frank. So were the Caldwells and the Morrisons and Ruth Morrison, who had come without being asked and was standing near the door with her hands folded. "It went well," Abigail said finally. "It went well," Luke said. Weld is sharp. He saw the timeline before Tom finished the sentence. He did. Luke looked at her. "You did that. The sequence you built, that's why he saw it." She turned to look at him, and in her face was something that had been growing for 12 weeks and was now very close to the surface, something that her careful composure could no longer entirely manage, because it was too large and too real, and had nowhere left to be contained. "Luke," she started. The door opened. Tom Radley leaned out. "Panel's ready." The finding was unanimous. The 1887 deed claim was rejected on the basis of insufficient original documentation and evidence of coordinated bad faith. The Maddox homestead boundary stood as registered. The state relief contract was confirmed unaffected. Arthur Weld's written finding included a specific notation that the filing appeared to constitute an improper attempt to exploit the arbitration process for competitive advantage, and that his office would be forwarding the documentation to the State Land Commission for review. That last part had not been expected by anyone, including Tom Radley, who read it and looked at Weld with an expression of genuine respect. Walter Marsh left the room without speaking to anyone. His lawyer followed him with the rapid, forward-leaning walk of a man who needed to catch a train. Gerald Foss stood at the table for a moment, after everyone else had moved, looking at the floor with the specific expression of a man reckoning with having attached his name to something that was now going to the State Land Commission. Luke shook Tom Radley's hand. Tom shook Abigail's hand and held it for a moment and said, "It was the sequence. The sequence was everything." "I know," she said. Ruth Morrison hugged her in the hallway, which Abigail received with the slightly startled stillness of someone still adjusting to being embraced by people, and then she hugged back. Clara Caldwell was next to Ruth, and she squeezed Abigail's arm and said, "We knew," in the tone of a woman stating a simple fact, and Abigail pressed her lips together and nodded, and did not cry in the hallway of the county courthouse, which took visible effort. Del Sutter shook Luke's hand. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have approved of her." Luke looked at him. Del Sutter never mentioned Luke's grandfather. The man had been dead for 30 years, and Del had worked for him as a young hand, and had never in all the years since brought him up voluntarily. "Yeah," Luke said, and his throat was slightly tighter than usual. "He would have." The Spring Community Festival happened 3 weeks later at the end of May, when the county gathered in the way it gathered every year, with long tables and fiddle music, and the particular communal energy of people who had survived a winter together and were glad to see each other in warm air again. Luke had not planned what happened. He had not prepared remarks or rehearsed anything. He was standing with Dell and Frank at the edge of the gathering when Martha Gibbons. Martha, who had said in her dry goods store that Abigail was peculiar and no man wanted a bookkeeper for a wife, walked over to Abigail with a covered dish and said in the carrying voice she used for everything, "I want you to know I was wrong about you. I said things that weren't kind, and they weren't true, and I'm sorry for them." The table nearby went quiet. Abigail looked at Martha Gibbons with the steady, clear gaze she brought to everything, and she said, "Thank you, Martha. That means something to me." Martha nodded briskly, set down the dish, and walked away with the posture of a woman who had done a necessary thing and was not going to make a production of it. Helen Trask, standing 2 feet away, looked at the ground and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Luke watched Abigail receive it. She stood for a moment after Martha left, looking at the table, and he could see her processing it, the specific strangeness of receiving grace from a direction you had stopped expecting it to come from. He walked over to her. She looked up when he reached her. "Did you hear that?" she said. "I heard it. I didn't expect that from Martha." "People surprise you," he said. "Sometimes in the good direction." She smiled, small, genuine, the private kind that belonged only to the feeling behind it, and he thought about a courthouse 5 months ago, and the first time he had seen that smile by accident before he knew what to do with it. He knew now. "Abigail," he said. Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "Luke, I need to say something to you." She waited. He had thought about how to say this. He had thought about it for several weeks, turning it over the way he turned over every important thing, making sure he had it right before he committed to it. He was not a man who said things for effect. He was a man who said things when he meant them completely. "I told you the morning of the arbitration to go to sleep, and I sat at the kitchen table after you went down the hall, and I thought about why I cared whether you slept. I thought about why it mattered to me. Really mattered, not because you needed to be sharp for the case, but because—" He stopped. Started again. "Because when you're tired, you get a particular line between your eyebrows, and it bothers me. It bothers me when you're tired or worried or carrying something too heavy, and I've spent 12 weeks telling myself that was just the reasonable concern of a man for someone who lives in his house." She was very still. "It isn't," he said. "I'm not going to pretend it is anymore." The fiddle music was playing somewhere behind them. People were moving and talking, and the festival went on in all its communal noise, but the 2 feet of space between Luke and Abigail had become the quietest place on the county fairground. "I didn't come to your office that morning to find a wife," he said. "I came because I needed a signature. I know that. You know that. We've never pretended otherwise." He looked at her directly. "But I want to tell you in front of whoever is paying attention right now that what I have with you is not the thing I went looking for. It's better. It's the best thing I didn't know to look for." Abigail looked at him. The composure she wore like a second skin was still there because it was part of her, and it did not disappear. But behind it, something was completely open, the carefully maintained distance, the professional steadiness, the armor built from 15 years of being passed over and talked about and politely dismissed. It was still there, the structure of it, but something had moved through it like light through a window, and she was standing in it, fully in the middle of a county festival, looking at the man who had sat across from her every morning for 12 weeks, and learned the difference between the face she showed the world and the face she wore when she didn't know anyone was watching. "I want to be honest with you," she said, and her voice was steady, but different, lower, more careful, carrying the particular weight of things said for keeps. "I agreed to that marriage because I had my reasons, practical ones, and I told myself that was enough to make it a reasonable decision." "Was it?" "No," she said. "It was an excuse. A respectable reason to say yes to something I wanted for a reason I wasn't ready to admit." She paused. "I wanted to be chosen. I wanted someone to look at me and choose me, not because I was useful, not because I solved a problem, but because they wanted me in their life." Her voice did not break. She would not let it break. "I have wanted that for a long time, and I stopped believing it was going to happen, and then you came into my office looking for a solution, And I thought this is the closest I'm going to get, and I took it. Abigail. Let me finish. She looked at him. I was wrong about what I was taking. I thought I was taking a practical arrangement. I didn't know I was walking toward something real. I didn't know you were going to sit up at 3 in the morning with me. I didn't know you were going to drive to 9 families and come back with letters. She stopped. I didn't know you were going to put your hand over mine in that courtroom and hold on. I held on, he said. I know, she said. I noticed? I notice everything, remember. He almost laughed. He felt it rise in his chest, that same impulse from the courthouse 5 months ago, and this time he let it a short, real sound. Surprised out of him, and she heard it, and something in her face broke open completely. The full smile, not the small private one, but the one underneath it that she had never let anyone see, because no one had ever given her the right context for it. Wide and genuine, and entirely beautifully unguarded. He reached up and took her face in his hands, the rough, calloused hands of a man who had worked this land for 22 years, and he held her the way you hold something you understand the value of. I choose you, he said. Not the contract, not the signature. You. I want to be clear about that. She put her hands over his. I know, she said. I believe you. Good, he said. And kissed her. Not on the cheek, not briefly, not the measured, careful gesture of 2 strangers performing a ceremony for 63 curious witnesses. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman when he has finally stopped arguing with himself about it, and she kissed him back the way a woman kisses a man when she has been waiting quietly and without complaint for exactly this and nothing less. Behind them, the fiddle kept playing. Someone near the long tables let out a sound that might have been a cheer and might have been surprise. Del Sutter, standing 30 feet away with Frank Aldridge, said nothing and looked at his boots and found something to smile about there. Cody Pruitt said yes out loud and did not look embarrassed about it this time. They drove home in the late evening with the last of the spring light behind them and the ranch road familiar under the wheels and the horses moving at their unhurried pace. The festival had wound down slowly, the way good things wind down, not abruptly, but in gradual release, people peeling away in pairs and families. The long tables emptied, the music finally stopping. Abigail was sitting close to him, not pressed against him. Nothing dramatic, but closer than she had ever sat in this wagon on this road. And his arm was around her, and hers was against his side. And it was uncomplicated, and warm, and entirely quietly right. Martha Gibbons will have something to say tomorrow, she said. Martha Gibbons always has something to say. This time it might be positive. Miracles do happen, he said. She laughed fully, without covering her mouth, the real version of the laugh he had heard once in the courthouse hallway at 3 in the morning and had been carrying around ever since. He tightened his arm slightly and she let him. After a while she said, I want to talk to you about something. All right. I've been thinking about the eastern pasture, the 40 acres that was disputed. Now that the claim is settled, the land is stable, and the title is clear. I think we should expand the grazing rotation. Hank has been saying for 2 years that the current rotation is straining the west field. She paused. And Patrick Morrison knows that land. He's been working it on Saturdays. I think you should offer him a full-season position. Luke drove for a moment. That's a good idea. I know, she said. And there was something in her voice, a particular warmth in the confidence of it, a satisfaction that was not arrogance, but simply the pleasure of being in a place where her thinking was welcomed. He pulled up at the ranch gate, and the horses stopped, and the night was wide and quiet and full of stars, and the land that had been his grandfather's and his father's, and his, stretched out around them in all directions, the same land that had been threatened and defended and held. He jumped down and opened the gate and led the horses through and closed it behind them, and he looked at the house with its single kitchen lamp burning, and he thought about everything inside it, the organized accounts and the neat ledgers, and the covered plates left on bunkhouse steps, and the notebook always open on the desk, and the coffee always made before he woke. Abigail stepped down from the wagon before he could help her. Old habit. She stood beside him and looked at the house too. We have fence work tomorrow, she said. We do. And I need to file the follow-up with the State Land Commission by end of week. I know. And Cody needs better work gloves. I've been meaning to say so for 2 weeks. His current ones are split at the thumb, and he won't ask. I'll get them Friday, he said. She nodded. She turned toward the house. Then she paused, and she turned back, and she looked at him in the way she looked at things she was deciding to keep, with the full force of her attention, clear and steady and completely present. Thank you, she said, for choosing this, for choosing me. He held her gaze. Thank you, he said, for walking through that courthouse door with your head up. She smiled, the real one, the full one. The smile that had first broken through his defenses in a courthouse 5 months ago, when she hadn't known he was watching and had given it entirely to herself, and that now she gave freely without armor, without apology to the man standing in front of her on the land they both called home. She had carried that smile through 15 years of being overlooked, through a town that had decided her story was already finished, through a marriage that had started as a transaction, and quietly, stubbornly, against all reasonable expectation, had become the truest thing in both their lives. It had always been worth something. It had just finally found someone who knew that. She went inside. He followed her home.